Hi there, and welcome to a special live edition of the Northern Agenda podcast, bringing you the politics news that matters for the North and from the North. I'm Rob Parsons, Northern Agenda editor for Reach, the people behind the Manchester Evening News and Newcastle Chronicle, and I write a daily newsletter about Northern politics called the Northern Agenda. Now, there's only one topic on the minds of politicians and business leaders in the North today, and that's Jeremy Hunt's first budget as Chancellor. He delivered it at lunchtime today, and there were some big national news lines. We saw a major expansion in state-funded childcare and tax breaks for businesses in budget measures aimed at boosting economic growth. A recession will now be avoided, but living standards are going to continue to drop, we were told, and inflation will drop dramatically. The energy price guarantee, which caps average household bills at £2,500, will be extended at its current level for 3 more months. And on those all-important fuel and beer taxes that I imagine we'll be reading about on the front page of the Sun tomorrow, the fuel duty freeze and the 5p cut will be maintained for another year, saving the average driver around £100. There's also going to be a Brexit pubs guarantee, which will see duty on draft products up to 11 pence lower than in supermarkets. So here's how the Chancellor ended his speech, which clocked in at just under an hour.
So, Madam Deputy Speaker, in November we delivered stability. Today it's growth. We tackle the 2 biggest barriers that stop businesses growing: investment incentives and labour supply. The best investment incentives in Europe, the biggest ever employment package, for disabled people more help, for older people barriers removed, for families feeling the pinch, fuel duty frozen, beer duty cut, energy bills capped, and for parents 30 hours of free childcare for all under 5s. Today, we build for the future, with inflation down, debt falling and growth up. The declinists are wrong and the optimists are right. We stick to the plan because the plan is working, and I commend this statement to the House.
But what was in the budget for the 15 million people in the north of England? That's what we're here to talk about, and we've got a fantastic panel full of expertise about northern politics and policy to dissect what it all means for people in our region. We've got Zoë Billingham, the director of the IPPR North think tank, Nicola Headlam, the chief economist at Red Flag Alert and former head of the Northern Powerhouse at the government cities and local growth unit, joining us in typically dramatic last-minute fashion. Thank you for coming, Nicola. Tom Lees, the managing director at the Manchester-based economics consultancy firm Bradshaw Advisory, and Henri Murison, chief executive of the Northern Powerhouse Partnership. What a great panel we've got. So nice to have you all on today. Thank you for joining us. So there's a lot to get to, a lot to get through. There's a lot to digest. I just want to go around everyone and just get a sense of what were the most significant bits of the budget for you, full hour-long speech? Zoe, first, what were the main sort of standout points?
Thanks, Rob. From my perspective and from looking at it from IPPR North's perspective, for the North and the 15 million people living here, the 2 levelling up offers were the trailblazer deals, both in Greater Manchester but also in the West Midlands, with the devolution of powers and policy in transport, skills and housing. This is a really welcome development on the devolution agenda, and again empowering our metro mayors, which we've long championed. So that was good to see today, and look forward to understanding how that can be fast forwarded for other areas. The second area for the North that was in investment zones. So the 12 investment zones announced across England. They were pretty modest in size, I must say, a 16 million contribution in each place per year for 5 years. That's not going to change the dial on regional inequality, but it is reassuring that the government has turned a leaf from simply a kind of tax race to the bottom in terms of regional development and offering kind of investment in the regions on the cheap, and instead looking at how we can invest in skills and transport in places. So those were 2 kind of positive developments. I would say, as it stands, neither were at the scale that is needed to shift regional inequality. So I'd say levelling up is still very much on life support at this moment, and that's somewhat surprising given that we're probably only 1 year out from a general election.
Absolutely. Tom Lees. Now it was billed, Tom, as a budget for growth. Had based around 4 E's, which I want to remember what they were. Employment.
That's never a good sign if we can't remember.
Well, exactly. But what did you make of it? Did it tick the right boxes for you?
Well, I mean, it was sort of, everyone imagines Jeremy Hunt's quite a sort of boring, dull kind of chap, and it was a bit boring and dull, but actually it was a lot more transformative and substantive than I was imagining. There's quite a lot of stuff in it. You know, the announcements around childcare, that was a big deal, right? Coming out with the trailblazing deals, as Zoe mentioned, that's a big deal. The investment zones, 20 billion for carbon capture. There's actually quite a lot of stuff in there. It was much more substantive than I was imagining, actually.
Interesting. And Nicola, would you agree with that? Obviously, you've been in government when these kind of announcements have been made. Like, what did you make of the whole thing?
Well, I've had a bit of a weird one today, to be honest, because I had 2 screens while the budget was on, and yeah, I was kind of, oh, Jeremy Hunt, this is exciting. And then also, the markets are absolutely tanking on their absolute arses, and Credit Suisse might be about to throw us all into a second round of banking crisis. So I've been in that slightly twin place of thinking that, you know, as engaging and as exciting as it is to think about some of the, you know, we have to go back around the loop again on LEPs and local government and all the rest of it. The bottom line is that some of the wider economic fundamentals are so precarious that sort of one weird butterfly wing flap in another country leaves us feeling really wobbly. So that's kind of what I've been thinking today and partly that's not only because I've been doing all the early morning slots all week talking about what might be in the budget, so I'm a bit over it on the day it actually happens.
So by the time the budget comes, you're already a bit bored of it. That's not an ideal position to be in. Henry, Lord Jim O'Neill from the Northern Powerhouse Partnership put out a quote today saying this budget feels like a return to the spirit of the sort of original Northern Powerhouse period and a new era for metro mayors and local government. So that sounds like your organisation is broadly in favour of what we've heard today.
I think it's all steps in the right direction, largely, and I think the Trailblazer stuff is the most interesting because it is a substantial shift in how things are going to work in this country. And we're pretty obsessed with fiscal devolution, and I know a number of other people here are as well. And it is a very substantial move in that direction. I think a lot of people obviously would like to go even further and faster, and that's understandable. But this is a big step in the right direction. And I think reflecting on some of it, I think the kind of levelling up kind of stuff for towns, and obviously there are some cities in there, mighty Wakefield obviously in that group, along with kind of Oldham and a number of others. That is still central interference, and that money is all kind of held conditionally, not given to mayors. So I think my only critique would be that the Trailblazers are in the right direction. Clearly, as Zoe says, the amount of money.
Oh, Henry, I think we've lost Henry. He's frozen for a minute. We'll see if we can get Henry back. So Henry was talking about the Trailblazer devolution deal for Greater Manchester, which I think the details of which have just been published in the last few minutes. And obviously this has been heavily trailed, but I guess the essence of it is that Greater Manchester and the West Midlands are 2 areas of the country which both have established mayors, one Labour, one Conservative, and they have been given powers comparable to what the London mayor has to shape their own destiny, new powers over things like education, transport, housing, but most importantly, they've got one single budget, I think the best part of £1 billion for Greater Manchester to spend as they see fit, rather than having to constantly bid to the government for small pots of money. We're just talking about the Greater Manchester Trailblazer.
Rob, if only you had someone on your panel who'd written their doctoral thesis called Manchester Work in Progress
That
Mechanism.
sounds like you, Nicola. Why don't you tell us?
In the Greater Manchester City region. It is a 10-year-old document. I know you've all read it carefully before inviting me on this panel, but I think that is where the devolution deals need to be seen as part of the constantly evolving governance of both Manchester and Birmingham. As I say, Manchester Work in Progress. It's great, and people have been working on they're enthused about having a few quid to spend. But I'm going to be slightly contrary. I then worry about, so with the LEPs kind of wrapping up, one thing that I was really clear about when we did sort of MP11 work was the difference in capacity between good old GM and your Cumbrias and your other smaller places. I really do worry, although I am a militant devolutionist and Greater Manchester, I'm hardly a Manchester man, but you know what I mean? Well, no, I'm not in the gang. Anyway, I've studied Manchester, I work in Manchester, worked on Manchester for 20 years. The edges of the city region don't always see the benefit of city regional funding, let alone the edges of the country. And my worry is that you speed up the already fast, but you slow down what is already on a slower growth trajectory. And some of the work I've been doing about the economics in general at the moment is that that in general, the economy is looking increasingly K-shaped all the time. So for every high line of this whizzy thing is happening, there's a low line as well, and the gap between your top line and your lower line kind of serves to it's a K-shaped economy.
So you mean that Greater Manchester might benefit from it, but perhaps the places around the edge of Greater Manchester, maybe into Lancashire or Cumbria or Cheshire, they might disproportionately. They might.
If you've lost a LEP and you're having local government reorganisation as Cumbria are, I don't think there's much to be that excited about. And again, we're sort of, I don't know, the city slicker agenda appears, you say Jeremy's not very interesting. He's clearly been reading his sort of Centre for Cities and is kind of, he's got his all his reports next to his bed for the kind of urbanists, the kind of muscular urbanists. But I'm not sure that necessarily helps us that much in terms of having a country that does work for everyone. So I don't know, maybe I'm just being a bit contrary, because obviously I want Manchester to get all the pounds and powers that it needs, but it's creating very twin track kind of subnational economics in an already quite febrile subnational economic context.
That's interesting. I mean, it seems like the sort of snap reaction I've seen to the Greater Manchester devolution deal seems broadly positive. The Onward think tank, which is obviously centre-right think tank, described it as a serious step forward, not quite the leap forward on fiscal devolution that it could have been. Fiscal devolution obviously being a mayor's ability to raise his own income for projects rather than having to go to central government for it. An interesting bit of feedback that I've had when I've run stories about devolution and Greater Manchester, not that there's been a huge flurry, but a few people have emailed me who say that they're concerned about Andy Burnham getting extra power without necessarily the accountability to scrutinise it. And it looks like we do know a bit about how Andy Burnham and Andy Street are going to be held accountable, don't we? There's going to be a committee of local MPs who are going to, I think every few months are going to quiz them in a similar manner to a select committee. I mean, Zoë, is that a good thing from your point of view? Is that going to make mayors more effective and accountable?
So I think it's inevitable that as the Metro mayors receive more power and resources under their control, that the kind of a question of accountability comes up, and that's quite right. If they're having responsibilities to the degree of a ministerial department, then it's quite right that increased accountability and scrutiny should come with that. I do have a few questions over this model, and I'll kind of be interested to debate this between us, because of course, kind of putting Metro mayors up in front of MPs creates this kind of new dynamic where Metro mayors have to sort of report to their local MPs, which is actually, well, obviously we don't have a constitution, but constitutionally that is a kind of interesting development, which is a bit messy, to be honest, although probably it's seen as the best option for now. So I think right to move forward on accountability, whether the kind of regional select committees with local MPs is quite the right model to be seen.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, any other feedback from the rest of you about what we've seen in Greater Manchester? I mean, it does makes Andy Burnham a more powerful figure. Tom, you're based in Manchester. Is that a good thing as far as you're concerned? If you move
I think. I mean, Nicola said something interesting about creating sort of twin track sort of economies, but you know, my sort of thought around this isn't it better to, so an ideal situation, maybe everybody's having a lovely time, everything's fantastic everywhere, but it's not really a realistic point to get to. And isn't it better to get a fantastic city in every region that's doing really well, that's trying to sort of help spread wealth and prosperity around the region, rather than it being this debate about North versus London, everywhere versus London. It's quite a novel development going now, complaining about Manchester and Leeds, right? And I think part of the issue with this is also remembering the competition's not sort of inter UK, right? It's Manchester competing with Amsterdam and Paris, and it's that competition level. So I think we get really obsessed with UK internal competition, and it's much bigger than that. So that's one point.
I'm not interested in competition at all. I want everyone to do well, but
well, it's not possible. It's not possible for everybody to do well, right? Some areas will have better businesses, better leadership, better strategies, and some areas will have worse, and that's what happens.
Well, that brings us on to another big announcement from the budget, which is investment zones, which are basically they're going to be 12 of these investment zones around the country, which is a dramatic scaling down of what we were originally going to have. Under Liz Truss's government, the vision was that there would be these investment zones where taxes and red tape are cut and bureaucracy is cut, so that these places would be all over the country. Now, there's only going to be 12, and they're going to be based around universities, and 6 of them are going to be in the north of England, in mayoral areas, which is quite interesting. Greater Manchester, West Yorkshire, Tees Valley, the North East, South Yorkshire, Liverpool City region are all getting one. I mean, are they going to be effective, Henry? Is that a step in the right direction as far as you're concerned?
I think my connection went when I was trying to say this before, but I think Zoe's right that 80 million quid over 5 years, which equates to what she was saying, isn't very much. But the business rates retention is much more important, because the uplift in business rates could be significant. And Helix in Newcastle, that is an old city deal I was involved in, which shows how long in the tooth I'm getting in a previous life. And that's generating big money now, serious money. So I'm more interested in things that have some long-term benefit to places and discretionary spend that they can then use to reinvest in growth, rather than just the sweeties. The 80 million incentives is unimportant to me. I actually think some of the flexible skills stuff, I've just been with Leeds City Council and they were really excited about that. So I think there is some stuff in there that is good. But if you think that you should give all of that as incentives to employers, because actually you don't need to give incentives to people to come and be, for example, at the Southern Gateway in Bradford or wherever, or in the innovation corridor around Leeds. That might be a case in some free ports for that, but it really isn't. I mean, and I think there's a case against as well, but there really isn't a case for it in city centres that are attractive locations. So I think a lot of that money should be spent on stuff that raises productivity and attracts higher value investment, rather than a kind of race to the bottom approach of I'll give you a few quid to come here rather than there. Because other than for FDI, obviously that leads to displacement, and kind of in the discussion we're getting into about, is this about competition or is this about collaboration? I think certainly being here in France this week with the cities all telling the northern story, certainly across the north, there is no competition. They see themselves as a unit and their interests are aligned, because what's good for Manchester is good for Liverpool. What's good for Newcastle is good for Leeds. It's not a zero-sum game. And I think that approach to economic development is where we need to get to. But I think that it's an argument that somehow cities are bad for their surrounding areas. I do think Cumbria needs a non-mayoral combined authority. That's what it needs if it doesn't want a mayor yet. And that is better than having a LEP. So I would argue that democratic decision-making is important. It's been great to get business people involved in this, but they largely haven't had that much power or role anyway. let's create serious institutions that do draw on the expertise of business people in meaningful ways, but that are centred on democratic accountability. I think that's the right model. And I think that that's what Jeremy Hunt's largely suggesting. But what I don't want to do is take economic capacity and policy making out of Cumbria. I agree with Nick about that. It's just not the right solution. But they could and should have gone from a non-mayoral combined authority by now. And this is the impetus to do that, because if you don't do that, you will have nouts. And so, I mean, I'm all for voluntary decision making by places, but the end of the road is now there. You either have a non-mayoral or a mayoral combined authority, or you're finished. And I think that hopefully will focus some minds.
We should probably say at this point, when Henry mentions that he's in France, you're at the MIPIM conference in Cannes, aren't you, Henry? Making us all very jealous. Although obviously you're not in the sunshine or on a yacht at the moment.
No yachts. And I've not been on a yacht, Rob, and I will not be stepping foot on a yacht.
Go on, Henry. You might as well make the most of it. Go and find one.
We know you love yachts, Henry.
I don't love yachts. No, that isn't the corporate image we're going for.
No, I don't think that will be helpful. I mean, there's an interesting case study of a investment zone that we don't know where in West Yorkshire or Greater Manchester, say, they're going to be, but we know in the Tees Valley that the investment zone is going to be in Middlesbrough, because Ben Houchin has declared that will be the case. And there's also obviously the big controversy in Middlesbrough at the moment over the creation of a mayoral development corporation, where lots of powers that have previously been held by the council are going to get handed over to this regeneration body, which has prompted a bit of a row there. And obviously Middlesbrough is a not a big city, it's a town. It's at the wrong end of a lot of the league tables on things like crime rates and poverty and things like that. I mean, is there an argument that an investment zone would be a good thing for a place like Middlesbrough? Would you say, any of you?
I think with investment zones, we did a lot of work on free ports. These sort of ideas have been around for decades and decades. They just change the name on them every few years. And some of the key problems with them are around having focus. What do areas actually want to be really good at? Do they actually know what they want to be good at and how to be good at it, and the tools and the different pieces to pull together to do it? And how easy to access some of the benefits and the bureaucracy that comes with these zones, which we don't know is going to exist yet. With free ports, some of the bureaucracy that's being put in place in terms of monitoring, evaluation, compliance is so arduous that it removes any benefits that may have come through the incentives. So it's also always proof is in the pudding of how they're actually implemented. So do they have focus? How is it going to be implemented? How is it going to be managed and run?
Yeah. Let's move on. Oh, sorry. Go on.
Just to build on that, I think also, as I mentioned earlier, it's good to see that the new reincarnation of investment zones are a combination, at least, of tax cuts and investment. Because when we're just focused on tax cuts, it's as if we want people to invest in the north or businesses to invest in the north because it's the cheapest place to do business, which the UK as a whole is never going to be the cheapest place to do business, because we have public health system, public education system that fundamentally supports workers and businesses to do what they do. So this kind of idea that we just make it cheaper and investment will follow is actually also not what businesses are calling for. They want stability and long-term certainty. And so I think the government seemed to sort of start to get that message, but obviously 1 year out of an election, that isn't perhaps very helpful to businesses who are looking for that.
Yeah. Now, let's move on to the two of the other E's that Jeremy Hunt spoke about, prompting a few jokes about, I'm going to do another E now, I think, or some words to that effect. Employment and education, the two of the other E's. And I mean, this is a big issue for the North, the effort to get people who are economically inactive into work. So the Northeast as a region has more economically inactive people proportionally than any other region, and quite a lot of the budget speech was devoted to tackling that problem, things like getting older people into work, and obviously the key one, sort of childcare reforms, free childcare for 1 and 2 year olds, more funding for wraparound childcare, so the care you get before and after your kids go to school, more childminders, things like that. I mean, this is something that people have been crying out for, and you know, Labour have been very vocal on this topic as well. I mean, with all these things in the round, do we think that goes far enough to address the sort of big productivity issues that the country has? Any of you?
I really welcome the childcare intervention, something that IPPR have been long calling for, and it will move to hopefully all under fives getting a 30-hour offer. At the moment, it's still very much tied to being a working parent, and it's also there's a kind of sliding scale, right, between 30 hours and 15. So that kind of uptick is really important. I think whether that works in practice will depend whether how childminder and childcare businesses respond, and whether the government is going to give them enough to actually be able to supply those places. So I think there's important design feature there. On the sort of long-term ill and helping those people back into work or supporting them in work, I felt, on the other hand, the proposals were a bit lackluster. There was mention of a sort of mental health fund to help support voluntary organisations. You know, I don't think that's going to shift the dial on preventing people getting into poor mental health or other conditions that are holding them back from working. So I think part good, part lackluster.
Interesting. There was a slightly cringeworthy moment that I don't know if you noticed, where the Chancellor, talking about the sort of measures he was introducing to bring more over 50s back into the workforce, he said, "Madam Deputy Speaker, I say this not to flatter you, but older people are the most skilled and experienced people," addressing Dame Eleanor Lang, the Deputy Speaker.
Why you pick a fight with a Madam Deputy Speaker? I don't know if he meant it. I think he meant it to be a compliment, but it came out as the most cat-handed thing I've ever.
I think he's not got a great sense of humour, and he was probably trying to have a joke, right? It's the truth of it.
Yes, I think that was what his intention was, but it was it did make me wince a little bit. I mean, Nick, what's your view on how did what we hear today go far enough to solve our productivity?
Well, crisis? I don't know.
We always hear about how we're lagging behind in productivity. Is this going to help?
Well, no, of course it's not. I mean, you know, I feel like I've had 4Es. Like, we've got 750,000 public sector workers on strike today. You know what I mean? It's like, and it was all very sort of smoothly does it. Inflation will be back down by to the end of the year by 2.9%, but it's 11% now. Like, I don't know, like in some ways it felt very, I understand like presentationally, it sort of, you know, it's still not a budget for growth if it doesn't talk about how we're going to be able to pay for the public services that we want and need, or, you know, as I say, there's nothing on, you know, my sister's a teacher and she's on strike today and she's like, this is great. It means I can watch the budget for the first time since I left university. And I was a bit like, I wouldn't, mate. There's no point. It's not for you. That, you know, it did feel slightly unreal given the scale of sort of some of the economic, again, if there was an industrial strategy worth having or a transformational something worth having, I think I might feel more excited. But as it is, as I say, it just feels to me like we're kind of waiting for something to happen. And again, the sort of stacked up, the to-do list is so enormous. And take, you know, a few things. I mean, gosh, the childcare thing I'm sure is integral to working parents. But I said that I was doing this thing, Fantasy Chancellor, on Radio 5 this morning, and we talked about the childcare thing, and suddenly I was just a bit like, oh, I've just realised that they're not really talking to me in the budget, are they? Because I'm child-free, I'm not on universal credit. It's a back-to-work budget, but I feel like I've worked even harder.
You're going to meet you'll benefit from the lifetime allowance being scrapped, Nicola.
That's right. That's right.
This is the lifetime pensions allowance.
Yay me. I'll be allowed to work till I'm 80. I will work till I'm 80 as well because I like it. I mean, that's another thing. I think we're talking before about people not wanting to be back in work. It depends if your work is interesting and stimulating and fun and brilliant, or if it's backbreaking and tiring and all the rest of it. Like there's different working lives happening, isn't there? And different sort of realities for people.
Yeah. Now, I just one other sort of element of the budget I thought I'd just touch on briefly, which is obviously energy and the energy crisis is the sort of backdrop that this all comes against, and the government is doing quite a lot to try and increase the amount of clean energy and reliable domestic energy that it can get. But obviously that is a long-term thing, and at the same time they're trying to hit their net zero targets. And there was a big announcement, which was £20 billion investment in carbon capture and storage, which has big implications for the north of England, I think, because there are a few parts of our region like the Humber, the Teesside, Merseyside, which are all trying to become world leaders in this, in sort of green technology and hydrogen, all that kind of thing. Obviously, it's sort of a global race, isn't it? Like the North and the UK are trying to race ahead in this technology so that we can get these jobs before other countries get them. Did we hear enough today about what the government is doing on that for our leading status to be maintained? Henry, do you think?
So, I mean, the key point is that the ambition was set up here, right, when we picked the clusters that we wanted. So Teesside with Humber making the East Coast, and then you've got Hainaut on the West Coast. It's still, I mean, this 20 billion was announced, I just double checked, back on Friday. It was leaked to The Guardian. So it's not new today, Rob. We've known about it for a few days. And I think it's exactly the right thing to do. But we need to make sure that we've got exactly enough money to do all the projects we want to do, because there's loads of them coming into the funnel. But that 20 billion, remember, is all leverage, right? So you put in some money to get this going, like we did with offshore wind, and all the capital actually is private. There's no actual requirement for government to borrow a penny. It's just about underwriting that investment until there's a market for carbon, because obviously we're going to tax carbon, and so there will be a market for sequestering it, because that will avoid you having to pay that tax. So it's a pretty good business model. I was quite excited about the small modular reactor stuff as well. We have obviously had an SMR competition before, so it wasn't maybe a great phrase choice from the Chancellor, because obviously people have already been on Twitter comparing when my now boss, George Osborne, announced a competition. But obviously the key point is, if you could actually start negotiating with Rolls-Royce SMR, who are based in Manchester, to get this going, then suppliers would start kind of seeing the benefits. The supply chain would start to gear up, and that would generate jobs as well. And I think that sort of economic point is key to the net zero transition. And Zoe and her colleagues have done a great job making this argument, which is that if you want to, carbon capture is about stopping people losing their jobs. If you don't sequester carbon, people at steelworks, people in other heavy industries on the Humber, in the northwest, up in the northeast, in Tees Valley, they will lose their jobs. I mean, we need to do that. Something like SMRs is fundamentally about creating more UK content. So just like we sort of didn't get quite right with offshore wind, where we built the turbines but didn't build them really in the UK. We build some of the blades in Hull, but that's about it. We with SMRs can fix that problem and actually make more of them here. And the link to the AUKUS stuff is that a lot of the same manufacturers who are going to be busy making submarines are also going to need to gear up, probably to be part of that supply chain, because the skill sets are very similar. And so actually in those heavy industrial sectors, we could see significant new jobs being created if we get our act together. But certainty is key. And so it says before the end of the year, but let's get our skates on, because the sooner we start that, the sooner the real economy starts to see some of the benefits. And that actually helps deliver the growth he wants. I mean, that it's not just committing to something that makes the difference. It's actually getting the jobs in the supply chain that we need to actually start being created. And that requires some certainty, which on nuclear, we have just not had, right? We've dilly-dallied for far too long. And at least now we've got a Chancellor who doesn't hate us and does actually want to do it. But he needs to not let his officials, who bluntly are not helpful in this space, get in the way. They've got to be told to start getting on with it. And the sooner he does that, the better.
Interesting.
May I just come in on this point, because I agree with a lot of what Henry's just said. I think just in the small print, the 20 billion was over 20 years, so that is only 1 billion a year, just to be clear. And IPPR, we call for
only a billion. A billion is quite a lot of money. I could do quite a lot with a billion. So is this a billion?
You can do a lot with a. You can do a lot with a billion, but I'm talking not just about carbon capture here, but about the wider net zero agenda and what the total envelope that is needed in order to really meet our net zero goals, which we've estimated at 30 billion a year. And when we compare to the US, with the US Inflation Reduction Act, that's already created 100,000 new jobs in this space, or is due to, that, that dwarfs the amount that we've managed in the UK. I think we're on about 11,500 jobs that have been tied to developments in net zero. And when we look to the EU, similarly, they're coming forward with bold proposals. So whilst I'm not undermining the fact that £1 billion is a lot of money in the context of what other actors are doing abroad, in the context of the 30 billion needed a year to achieve our net zero goals, the government's budget today was startlingly quiet, I would say, on net zero, save for that one commitment.
Yeah, well, that takes us on to the final topic. We've got just 2 or 3 more minutes just to whiz round, and just was there anything, or what the one particular thing that you were wanting to hear in the budget that we didn't hear? I mean, the one thing that immediately springs to mind to me is transport. There was virtually nothing about transport or HS2 or Northern Powerhouse Rail or buses or anything like that. I mean, also obviously social care, the public sector pay deal, none of that was really mentioned. I mean, Tom, was there anything that you were waiting out for that you didn't hear?
I mean, just before I give you a quick answer on that, I mean, there's always talk about this £1 billion a year, but you've got to add up the other parts of the puzzle that are already being pledged. So there's an important thing around classification of SMRs as ESG investments, which could help drive a lot of private sector investment. There's catapults doing things. There's other funds there. So it's not. To be fair to the government, it's not just there's £1 billion a year and that's it. There's lots of different pots and lots of different funds going on.
Yeah.
In terms of what we didn't hear about, I think one of the other things that with sympathy with Zoe, that I think we're missing a trick on, and we know we're so fantastic at missing out on major global opportunities. It's one of our sort of specialities. We sort of spot them and then we don't get our act together for a long time. I think it's sustainable aviation fuel. There was there's plans to put a big plant in Immingham, all around different parts of the UK and the North. Could create many thousands of green, high quality jobs, help aviation transition towards net zero. They need to have a contract for difference mechanism to help make that affordable and happen. So that's one of the things I would have liked to hear about.
Thank you, Tom. Zoe, what any particular glaring omissions as far as you're concerned?
Yeah, so absolutely. In addition to kind of further moves on net zero, like you, Rob, on the transport front, I was ready for a screeching U-turn on the delay to HS2, but that wasn't to be. No mention of Northern Powerhouse Rail. And then the third area, which I think is a question of fairness across economy as well as for the North, is the taxation of wealth. And IPPR have long called for the equalisation of taxation on income and wealth. That's aligning capital gains with income tax, so that work pays as much as wealth pays. And you would think it's quite a simple adjustment to make the economy fairer, but no movement on that either today. So those are my 3 areas.
Interesting. Nicola, we know you spelt out in vivid detail what you wanted to hear from the budget but didn't hear. So I'll give Henri the final word.
There was something else I wanted. It was a plan for growth.
Give us one last one.
It was the plan for growth. Look, Henry's got the sun just taking over his.
I know. It's clearly moving. I feel like it's coming after me. So I think my thing that I was really keen to see was on the investment rules, because the reason we lost HS2 in terms of another delay was simply because the GDP numbers were slightly worse, and so it looked like they bust this artificial target to reduce debt as a proportion of GDP. But that includes big projects like HS2. We now saw yesterday that DfT officials were saying exactly what me and other people said when it happened. A lot of them know a lot more about infrastructure than I do, the chair of the National Infrastructure Commission, that this would make the project more expensive. So I do think Rachel Reeves has got a point about that. That spending rule is a bit duff. So they may have nicked the childcare stuff from Bridget Phillipson, which was obviously a very smart political move. But I wish they'd nicked Rachel Reeves's fiscal rule on debt, because it's a pretty good rule and it's much better designed to avoid OBR forecasts creating complete carnage in the capital programme for no apparent reason, apart from, in the end, increasing the overall cost of projects, which I do think is a bit nutty bananas, if I'm honest, Rob. So it's rules of the game stuff for me. It's not just what a chancellor wants. It's the rules they apply, and often the rules do more harm than the political judgment does.
Yeah, that's interesting. I guess we'll hear more reaction, and we'll hear more of the small print of the budget coming out in the next few days. But we've run out of time, so I want to say thanks to Zoe, to Nicola, to Tom, and to Henry. Thanks so much for joining us. I hope you at home found that an interesting 40 minutes discussion on the budget. And if you want to hear more about what was in today's speech, you can subscribe to the Northern Agenda newsletter, which you can find at www.thenorthernagenda.co.uk. I've been Rob Parsons, and it's been great to have you. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.